Howdy. I thought I'd do a relatively quick recording or two on service fabric mesh. I was just kind of playing around a little bit with one of the microservice infrastructures for Azure. And a disclaimer is I don't claim at all to be an expert on this. I'm just kind of fishing or kind of doing a little bit of poking around, much similar in the way an architect would do on a project if they were just trying to research what service fabric mesh is and things of that nature. But basically, it's a very interesting concept and service. Microservices are one of the things that I'm, very interested in continuing to learn more and more on the side, with and things of that nature. And in the workplace and stuff, we're a full-blown AWS environment workshop, and so I don't really get a chance to do much with Azure. So I noticed Azure has a service fabric mesh, which is basically it's a fully managed service, and it handles your microservices for you in a way, by managing infrastructure, and it handles its own storage and networking, and it's predominantly based on the actor programming model pattern. And if you want to learn a little bit more about actors, you can do a search for it and things of that nature, because that's kind of outside the scope of this. But basically, my understanding of actors are it's kind of like the unit of work pattern in a single threaded concept, basically, where you can have as many unit of work instances of the same actor type, and each instance will have their own state, and they'll be able to send messages to other actors as well as to create other actors, and they run in a single threaded concept, environment. And so Azure has that. Now, one of the things I will mention is, I had heard, and basically this is not my opinion, this is just something that I had heard. The actor pattern has been somewhat rejected a little bit as of recently by the microservices community and such. So my understanding, and again, please chime in or make a comment or something like that. But my understanding is Microsoft may be switching more and more to the Kubernetes AKS type platform, if you will, for orchestration. Whereas and that's not the knock service fabric mesh. It sounds like a great idea, and I think there's been, probably from what I've read, successful implementations of it out there, and it fits naturally within the microservices environment and platform. So nevertheless, I still wanted to just kind of poke around and get a high-level overview of it. But again, Service Fabric Mesh is a fully managed service, and it sits on top of the Azure Service Fabric, which is extremely flexible, and it allows you to deploy what are known as applications, which are basically bundled within manifest files, and they are uploaded or deployed into Azure in the form of containers. Not only are they deployed up into Azure, which I'm looking at right here in my own Azure portal. As you can see, I've got a mesh application right here. And I'll just quickly kind of show you how that works. But you can also debug locally by downloading, the Service Fabric local cluster manager, and by which, what you're looking at right here is I am running the Service Fabric Mesh Explorer for this given app that I'll show you a little bit about. And no, I did not write the app. I got it as a tutorial from Microsoft's website, and so can you, if you just kind of wanted to learn a little bit about it. But running locally, there's not much to it. But basically, this is kind of like a to-do list application where, we have a web front end, which kind of runs in its own service, in its own application per se. and it's pulling data from another service, which is kind of running in its own container. And here's the data that it's pulling. And so the Service Fabric Explorer right here is just kind of showing you, you know, how many nodes you have. You can do up to 5 for debugging if you want to test scalability, how many different applications you have out there. So as you can see, here's my to-do list application that I clicked on. And it could just show you the general health and state of the system itself. Now, I went ahead and deployed this application out to my own Azure account right here, and that's what you're kind of looking at right here. Under the to-do list app resource group, you know, I've got the mesh, which shows 2 services. We have a front-end service as well as a to-do service. So the to-do service is kind of sitting behind the firewall, and both of these are running in Docker containers behind the scenes. And so as a part of your deploy, it's going to package your application up into and create Docker containers, and those are basically what are being uploaded into the service fabric and orchestrated per se by Service Mesh. And not to be confused, you know, a lot of this seems very, very similar to Kubernetes, which is really seems to be more of the de facto container orchestration service out there. But the Service Fabric Mesh tends to eliminate some of the complexities with setting up your own Kubernetes cluster, as far as getting that production ready, and as far as setting up and basically load balancing your networks and things like that that you would normally have to set up and configure with Kubernetes. The Azure Service Fabric Mesh takes care of that for you and does a lot of the scaling for you behind the scenes, so you do not have to worry about that. So you're paying for a really good managed environment behind the scenes that knows how to just automatically scale up and down. So it's almost like a serverless architecture for microservices based on containers, which is quite an interesting concept. And my only concern again is from what I have heard from other sources that, you know, being that the service mesh is based highly on the actor pattern, and the fact that actor patterns are being somewhat kind of like rejected in the microservices community, I'm just not 100% sure what kind of traction Service Mesh will continue to have. I know there's companies that have successfully used it and things of that nature. So I'm not here to knock it. I was just kind of playing around and exploring it. What you're looking at right here is the backend service, which is based on ASP.NET Core, bundled up into a container. And when you access it, it's going to basically call the get method, and it's returning this data right here. So if you kind of wanted to play around with this, you know, I could provide a link to the tutorial that I was taking, but basically it's on the Microsoft Doc site where they walk you through creating a mesh application where you can debug it and deploy it and upgrade it, and then you would just go ahead and clean up your resources. But some of the things I kind of wanted to mention, this tutorial seems to be a really good one for getting your feet wet. I am running Microsoft Visual Studio 2017. As of right now, basically in May of 2019, apparently the Visual Studio 2019 preview does not support writing applications with it, so you will not have a Service Fabric Mesh project. So you're looking at Visual Studio 2017, and if you do a file new and you go to cloud, you can see the Service Fabric Mesh application type that you actually have to download or add as an extension to Visual Studio 2017. So you can go basically to your extensions and updates, and you can take a look at, you know, like all of your installed extensions that you have. And as you can see, I've got Service Fabric Mesh Tools Preview. And that's something that you're going to want to download if you want to. As a matter of fact, you're going to have to download it in order to do the tutorial and create service fabric mesh applications. What you're looking at here is nothing that I've written. It's just basically I was following the tutorial. Again, I'm not an expert at this. I'm just kind of fishing for knowledge, much in the way that an architect would do. But following this tutorial, as you can see, basically, you end up with what I've got right here are two services. I've got a to-do service, which is our back end, and I've got a web front-end service. And basically, the web front-end service is what you're looking at. Well, this is the back-end service, so I apologize there. But the front-end service itself can be obtained by, if you look here, I've actually published this application locally to my Azure account. So I can actually hit this URL, which goes up into Azure. And basically, in that aspect, I'm just hitting the front end right here. And so that's actually going out to the front end service itself, and it's invoking that and displaying the data. So the front end is actually making another API call to your back end service. And again, you can run that locally, which is what I have done right here. So here's basically the front end right here. And this actually is hitting the local service mesh cluster that you can download and install, so that way you don't have to keep deploying your application out to Azure and stuff like that. So when you do a managed local, as a matter of fact, what you can see right here is you can set up 1 node or 5 nodes, if you will, whatever you like. And you can also look at your Service Fabric Explorer to kind of debug things and take a look at your requests as they happen. You can look at your metrics, basically, and you can take a look at your manifest, which basically is your package bundling for your whole application, as well as taking a look at some of the events that have gone on. You can see your individual nodes, again, in your application, all kinds of good stuff there. So getting back to the application itself, the solution itself, when you create a mesh application, it kind of creates this manifest project. It's like a resource project. And as you can see, these are your environments for when you deploy to the cloud, as well as when you deploy locally to your local service mesh. So again, we have 3 projects, actually 4. We've got our application resource project, which is generated for you. We have our to-do service, and we've got our web front end. Basically, anytime you want to add like another project or whatever, if you will, another service, you can say new service mesh service right here and call it whatever you want. I'm not going to do that. But when you do it, it'll go ahead and create yet another service project here for you. And as you can see, I've also got a model project. So this is a model that can be shared between all of your services. And what we've got going on here is our front end. So again, this is our GUI. And as you can see, one of the things, if we take a look at our to-do service, this is our API REST endpoint. So these are running as 2 separate services. We have a controller file, which is kind of nice because here you can see I've got some breakpoints. So the long and short of it is the front end service, which you're looking at right here, is making a call to the to-do service to get the data to display right here for the description and the done. And that's what's going on right here. So this is the back end. So the front end, basically when you go to the view here, is invoking the API REST endpoint within the view model. So if you take a look at the front end right here, the Razor view, behind the scenes, this is actually rendering when the model itself loads, the page model. When the page is being returned back to the client, it's actually going to go ahead and make this call to the back-end service. So it's calling the actual to-do service. And if you take a look at here, it's kind of cool, but you can get environment variables. As you can see right here, we've got these environment variables of API host port, and here's the actual endpoint, the API to-do, which is, if I do this, API to-do, let's see here. Okay, it has to be port 81. And so it's making a backend call to this. So this URL, the to-do thing, is actually coming from the environment variable called API host port. And so one of the things here is if you take a look at the service resources, this is in the actual web front end. It's just another YAML file. These are where you pass in your environment variables right here. And so these get propagated and interrogated and pulled in right here in these particular values. So that's what's going on right here. So each service itself, so we've got the backend to-do service and the front end. They're going to have their own service resources and their own sets of environment variables going on here. I could go into more details, but what happens is these get bundled up into containers. So one of the things you notice whenever you add a new service here is you'll see a Docker file, and this is actually generated. And these are Windows containers that we're running, but and my understanding is they could also be Linux containers as well, but you would have to manually deploy those, and you can't really debug the Linux containers locally in your service mesh, your local Explorer there. But anyways, I did not write these. Visual Studio generates these Docker files for you. So as a part of your publish, which is what I've done right here, after deploying it, you can see we're publishing the application. It goes through, it's kind of like a Docker Compose, if you will, but it's basically pulling down your images right here from the hub repository, and it's creating like different stages of your build stage, and then it creates a final stage, and it basically publishes the app up to Azure, and here's your DLL. And when the publishing is done, basically it goes through these steps. It takes a while. You get for all of the services that you have in your project that you publish, you basically get successful endpoint up into Azure. Now, one of the other things I wanted to mention is you can use, like after you do a publish and stuff like that, you can use the Azure CLI to actually get the status of your deployments, your services. So let me just show you right here. One of the things I wanted to mention is, so here I'm actually doing an AZ Mesh app list. You'll have to download an Azure CLI extension for PowerShell in order to get the mesh. So out of the box, you're not going to get the mesh command itself. So as you can see right here, I'm querying my own Azure account through the CLI to get the status of my to-do list app, and you can see the location that it's in. In order to do the extension, if you got the Azure CLI, you just need to type in it through your PowerShell command prompt, AZ extension add -- name mesh. And once you do that, you'll be able to get, you'll be able to query basically your mesh applications. You can see right here, I'm trying to get information about the to-do list app through the CLI. As you can see, it gives you the status, and it gives you the services. So the to-do list app actually has the services inside of them. So there's commands that you can run there. One of the other things I wanted to show you was debugging locally. And let's just say that we wanted to debug our controller, for example, on the back end. You can go to your back end controller and set breakpoints right here. And I will go to the front end view model for our index. And I'll set a breakpoint right here when the page is about to be returned back through the browser. It goes right here, and this is where we make an actual call. We're going to go ahead and debug. And you want to make sure that your local service cluster is turned on. I have one node. And by the way, one of the other prerequisites to get this working is you'll need to make sure that you have Docker for Windows installed and set up and configured. And also you want to make sure that you have Windows containers set. So as you can see, I've got my Docker for Windows right here. And I've got Windows containers set because you can see right here we've got switched to Linux containers. So you'll need to do that as well. And what I'm doing right here is I am starting up the application locally, which is what we've got going on right here. So just give it a second. Actually, it's hitting the breakpoint right here inside of the page view model right here. And as you can see, we have successfully pulled out this backend URL. It's pulling it out from the environment variables, as you can see right there. And when I hit continue, it goes right into the other service, which is kind of cool. And it allows you, so this is where we're actually setting, returning back our list of to-do counts, which is what we've got going on right here. So it's just a nice, it's a nice environment. It's kind of a shame from what I've been hearing about the fact that, the Service Fabric mesh may potentially go the same route as Silverlight and other things like that, but it's still, this is a good exercise to learn a little bit about what it is. There may be other applications out there utilizing this. But I hope this helps anybody who's interested in learning a little bit about what the Service Fabric mesh is all about. So thanks for watching, and I'm sorry if I droned. I was just kind of making this up off the top of my head. So have a great one, and thanks again.